So thank you very much. Thanks to the RSC for welcoming me here. My name is Lauren, and these are the results of a short project that I've worked on. And maybe to start on a slightly more hopeful note than the usual European conversation on migration, you may have heard about what is happening currently in Spain. The regularization of up to 1 million immigrants. And what you may not know about it is that it was the result of a 6-year campaign led by migrants themselves. And they insisted on including the notion of vulnerability in this specific process, which is why, contrary to all the previous so-called extraordinary regularizations that happened in Spain, this one is not directed only at migrants who had a job offer or family ties in the country, but also at vulnerable migrants. And they also succeeded in changing the definition of vulnerability, as you may see here, in a very loose definition that could include many people, as it is here linked to any form of circumstances that could affect living conditions. So, vulnerability is quite a complex topic. Defining it has led to a very important philosophical work, but in migration studies, it has mostly been analyzed as a technology of governance and mostly as what was called a neoliberal sorting device that rationed protection to a portion of migrants. However, most of the research does not focus on how migrants themselves can claim that notion and can also contribute to redefine it, not only in their own mobilization, but also in the law, as they did in Spain. So to try to understand this, I did a 3-month ethnography of the migrant-led pro-regularization movement, which is a movement that started from smaller groups 6 years ago during the pandemic and that expanded now to almost 60 different collectives. So I stayed mostly in Madrid, as you can see here, participated to the events, to the general meetings and the weekly meetings, and these debates around how to strategically use vulnerability emerged from the meetings themselves. The very first meeting I attended in February started with saying this notion of vulnerability that we claim, it's quite ambivalent, isn't it? Because it gives too much hopes. So, sorry, no. I tried here to simplify in 3 parts the strategic uses of vulnerability and the sort of strategic threats that come with it. So it's a very simplified table. My idea being that the use of that language is gendered and started as a way to describe a sort of lived experience and then was built as a legal mechanism, as a structural and collective category to broaden the regularization to categories that were otherwise excluded from previous processes. But also in order to gain moral legitimacy where rights-based language was not as efficient. So to try to explain a little bit more, irregularity in Spain is increasingly feminized. A few years ago, 6 out of 10 irregular immigrants were women, and now it could be more, most of them coming from Latin America. And in the movement, it's even more than this, because this movement emerged from local care support groups that were led mostly by women, and that first started to use the language of vulnerability among other terms in order to describe the body, physical experience of migration, and especially linking it to gender-based violence, claiming that victims of gender-based violence should have access to legal status, even if they had no legal formal contract. And using that claim, they also started to build a broader one, including all the persons who had no formal contracts, and stating that vulnerability was a product of irregularity. So it was a structural claim and collective claim in order to avoid all the individualized assessments that usually go with these processes. And they did succeed. You may have seen that in the very first drafts of the decree, the government presumed all irregular migrants to be vulnerable and thus to have access to this legalization process. However, I think on that side, they were faced with what is called constructive ambiguity in diplomacy. The fact that the government and the collectives did not agree, well, did agree on the term, but did not understand it quite the same. And so even though the government agreed on a definition loose enough for anyone to apply, they kept the individualized assessments. And so the lawyers and also some ex-migrants, well, or migrants that have been regularized are now assessing others and are doing so with a very flexible definition, which means that sometimes they understand it as anyone can apply, but they also rely on subjective perceptions of what is vulnerability. For instance, the lawyer explained here that they refuse to give vulnerability certificates to people who do not have a clean criminal record, even if it was never in the definition. And for these reasons, many inside the movement are contesting that strategy. Some of them because they think that using just vulnerability as an adjective reinforces the idea that they're passive victims to be saved rather than political subjects, and that it reinforces the line between the innocent, already tolerated migrants, usually perceived as female, and the more criminalized one. And so they try, especially the domestic worker collectives, to talk about, well, it's hard to pronounce in English, vulnerabilización, being vulnerabilized, made vulnerable, to denounce the state's responsibility in producing this vulnerability. Others, such as otras, which translates as Organization of Sex Workers, refuse to make their claim through vulnerability whatsoever and try to use entrepreneurship and job offers because they believe that shifting away from rights-based language was an error because it diminishes their other claims based on labor rights. And so they try to shift away from that language. So this strategy was a partial success, I would say, because it did broaden the regularization in unprecedented numbers. Now we're almost up to 1 million applications, which has never been seen in the history of extraordinary regulations in Spain. However, it still benefits mostly to already preferred migrants, Latin American, mostly women, working in the domestic and care sector, whereas other administrative mechanisms are excluding mostly African immigrants in the country. And besides, the redefinition of vulnerability is only valid for this specific process and was explicitly stated by the government. So it was a success, but a very limited one because we don't know if it's going to be renewed. There is no guarantee that even this legal status will be renewed for more than a year. But they still understood it as a form of success and celebrated the inclusion of vulnerability. And the collectives are still there. They're still working. So maybe in the future, we'll see what it will lead to. Well, thank you very much for listening.